Welcome everybody to the Global Innovation Hub for this session on cities, exploring how we raise finance and deploy capital in ambitious ways to meet the city's ambitious climate targets. I hope everybody is in the right place, having heard that. Something that's obviously very important if you consider that apparently 60% of the $32 trillion needed to meet ambitious climate targets will need to be deployed outside North America and Europe. So there's a lot that has to be done. We have to think about it in a global context. Okay, lots of different speakers here. My name is Ikenna Azuike. I'll be your host today. Can everyone actually hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. We have grouped our discussions today around 4 different themes, okay? First, we'll be looking at success stories, where are cities already effectively raising and deploying capital? And then we'll look at the obstacles that are holding back funding from the private sector and donors. We'll take a glimpse into a possible future. We'll consider what creative ideas and opportunities are out there to address those challenges. And lastly, just really think practically, what are the next steps? And I'd make a call, you know, our time is all very valuable and you know, we've got to do so much in such a little time. Just make a call to all of the speakers to be as provocative, as spiky as possible, as plain speaking as possible, calling out names. See some wry smiles out there. Okay, right, who are the panelists? First of all, we were supposed to have with us from the Bezos Earth Fund, Miss Amanda Eichel. She got in at 3 a.m. this morning. Hopefully she'll be able to join us at some point. Joining us online, Miss Divyata Ashiya. Divyata, welcome. Good, lovely wave there. From the Long-Term Investment Coalition, lots and lots of finance experience. High levels and working with large cities now in the global south, in particular with some exciting projects in Jakarta, so we'll be hearing about those shortly. Mr. Jonas Kamleh is a lead climate strategist for the city of Malmö in Sweden. Jonas, welcome.
Thank you, a pleasure to be here.
Great. Mr. Julio Lumbreras, founder and director of City 2030. Julio, are you online? Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Great. Hi. Thank you very much. Julio is a professor at the Technical University of Madrid and Harvard School of Public Health, and is also a EU Cities Mission Board member. And Michael Sharon. Michael is not yet online, right? Oh no, he hopefully also will be joining us in person shortly. I'll talk about him later. And sitting next to me live, Rodrigo, it's just you and I here. The International Relations Coordinator for Sao Paulo in Brazil. Okay, let's kick things off with our first discussion theme and some examples of success stories. But I'd like to get a sense from a kind of city perspective and a private finance perspective as to what success actually looks like in this context. Why don't we go, Jonas, why don't you kick us off? What is a successful raising of finance and deployment of capital actually look like? Paint us a picture for us.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I think for me, one brilliant example of how this actually plays out in the real world was when our finance director reached out to me and said, look, Jonas, I would like for you to meet the potential funders that we have for our green bonds in Malmö and talk about the climate work that we do. And the potential funders were very impressed by the robustness of the work that we're doing. And it ended up with us actually getting the lowest rate for the loans that we have, that we've ever had. And we're actually the cheapest ones borrowing money right now in Sweden as a city. And so having a robust framework and a robust way of working is something that reduces the risk for potential funders. And that's something that's very positive. So I think that's a good example of when you actually start to talk inside your own organization and bring different kind of capabilities together.
Flesh that out a little bit for us.
I'm sorry, we lost you there.
Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
When you say robust, can you just flesh out what that means in practice?
Absolutely. So for us, a robust way of working, it always starts with a mutual understanding of the goal, as in where do we actually want to go, and then understanding where are we today, the current system, and then identifying how much of the gap are we bridging with the measures that are already in play today, and what else do we need to do in the future to overcome the remaining gap that we have. And then the robustness is in the way that we work together. And so it's not only the city that does this, but this is about how we work together with investors. It's about how we work with infrastructure owners, with academia, and so forth. And then also having that not only a climate perspective, but also have a socioeconomic perspective on it, so that we can understand who needs to invest in what, who actually gets to enjoy the benefits of the various investments that are happening, and so forth. So it's a very complex way of working, but it also allows for some really major achievements to happen in a very short amount of time. And I think that's very interesting to see how fast this can actually deploy once you get a good mutual understanding of your city.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Super interesting. You touched on a lot of things. I think we're going to hear a lot about more the complexity. These things aren't simple. We need to embrace that complexity. And those interesting collaborations also with academia. I'd like to come back to that later. Julio, perhaps you'd like to talk about some of the success stories.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here online with you. Building on what Jonas was saying, I would say that a first thing that cities are doing in Europe, and that's interesting under the cities mission, which has 112 cities in Europe, the big cities and medium-sized cities, over 50,000 inhabitants, is to develop an economic case. So can you hear me? We cannot
turn the volume up a bit, but keep talking. Maybe a little bit louder.
Okay.
Great.
Now, great. No, I was saying that I want to build on what Jonas said, because one thing that I think it's interesting and is what cities under the European Cities Mission are doing is developing an economic case, like a starting point. And the idea of economic case is quantify how much investments are needed in a city to become climate neutral, which means to completely transform the city, right? And the main takeaways from the process we have been doing for several cities in Europe, and in particular in Spain, with the 7 cities that are part of the mission, is first that the economic case is positive. So there is more benefits than the costs associated to that. Although the problem is it's a financial problem, because the investments need to be done upfront, while the benefits are in a longer term. So first is a benefit economic case. Second, the amount of money that is needed, it's around 10,000 euros per inhabitant. So I live in Madrid. So for example, in Madrid, for a 3.5 million city, there is a need of at least 35 billion euros. So it's a lot of money needed. Next idea, this money shouldn't come from the municipal budget. So in all the cases, in no city is more than 10%. So there is private capital needed, coming both from citizens and from businesses. So we need to create a space, and we'll talk about this later, to bring private capital to the floor.
And Julio, is there a concrete example of this having happened in Madrid? Just to sketch out in general terms.
Yeah, so for example, in Madrid, we did the economic case, and we split the investment needs between citizens, business, utilities, and the municipal budget. And we have quantified which is the amount of money that is needed to invest from all the stakeholders. So yes, we've done this for Madrid, for Valencia, for Seville, for Zaragoza, for Vitoria-Gasteiz, for Barcelona.
And give us a number. Valladolid. How much has been raised in this way?
So, well, we are working now on bringing the private sector to the city, and then maybe come to the next question, right? Which are the barriers you mentioned? And there is language barriers. There is also a lack of trust. We need to reduce.
But it hasn't actually happened yet. No money has actually been raised. You're working on developing these relationships and this approach, but no money has actually been raised yet in this way.
Well, we've been raised money for some municipal investment through different instruments, through the European Commission Next Generation Fund, through also private companies working, for example, to buy electric buses through bonds and other instruments. And now also at the retrofitting sector, we are bringing money from banks, Spanish banks, to, to give loans to the citizens. So
Okay.
we have some examples, mainly in the mobility and retrofitting sector, but it's not massive yet. We are working on upscaling the process.
Clear. Thank you very much, Julio. Rodrigo, from a Brazilian, from the Sao Paulo perspective, I should say.
Hello?
I think just talk loudly. I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So first of all, yes, I would like to thank the invitation. For us is very important to be here as a representative of a local government and a city from Latin America, from the global south. And well, this is a very complex questions to raise funny and private investments. What we do in São Paulo is to try to advance the advocating in cities network in order to advocate more access to finance, to international finance. We have in São Paulo our local budget in order to implement the climate action plan, but it is still a very complex situation. So what we do is to be in very close connections with cities networks at C40s and ICLEI in order to try to get more international investments to implement this project. That's it.
Yeah, to learn from your peers, as it were. And hopefully there'll be a lot of that here today. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Divyata, from the private finance perspective, what is working, what does success look like from your kind of industry's perspective?
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me along. I'll just build a little bit on some of the points that have already been made, obviously with real live cases, with some of the folks working very much within the cities themselves. From a financing perspective, the challenges obviously are multifold, but I think there's many good ideas that I think are being worked on and many good success stories that I think are increasingly coming into place, which is also critical as we aim to build a little bit more of a track record, which I think is critical in attracting more capital. I think many different phases that I think are important to point out here. I think just at the very outset, framing what the project itself actually is a critical part of what is important to define with real clarity. And part of that is really developing a thoughtful RFP, which in itself, especially when it comes to many cities globally, many developing or cities specifically in developing markets, the RFP construct itself is in oftentimes where things
Divyata,
fall down.
for my
so
benefit,
being able to build
sorry.
on that in a really thoughtful fashion is critical.
For my benefit,
in order
what would the
for-
RFP, can you just spell that out?
It's the request for proposal, effectively, what the technical aspects that are required from a build, an own, an operate, a financing, all of the different aspects that are meant to be addressed in order for a potential investor or a particular financial instrument to understand how bankable or how investable a particular project is. Beyond that, I think it really is about bringing, and this again is obviously related, it really is about bringing the most thoughtful investors that are aligned to the project itself to the table. Again, part of the challenge has been, has there been enough for track record? Part of the challenge is has it been bankable? And part of the challenge has it been returns, have the returns themselves actually been interesting enough for the investors to come forward. I think with some of the earlier pillars in place, this starts to become much more interested. But I also believe that one important element of success is to not just bring outside investors in, but to also continue to build on the domestic and the local financial system. Part of the challenge, I think, historically has been that there is an expectation, in a sense, for outside investors who are less familiar with that to come in. And to build on what Julio said earlier on, in terms of the robustness of what one is aiming to build here, is one is aiming to build a robust financial system, which also includes both the local and the domestic financial institutions, such that they can then become very much party and aligned to a broader financing mechanism that
Divyata,
that we can build.
Zooming in on the need to build on that local financial system and the actors in that sector, is there a specific example, for instance, from Jakarta that you can share?
Sure. I mean, I'll speak more broadly. Just from a developing country perspective. I think in the context of developing countries, we have something like I think 58 national development banks that have accessed international capital markets to build on their operations. And this is something, and this is excluding China, but the volume of issuance from developing countries has actually been reducing over the last 3 years. And there are, on the other hand, a plethora of new financial instruments by way of green bonds, different financing facilities, climate resilient bonds, and a lot of capital has in fact actually been raised specifically to address the climate challenge. But the participation, if you will, from the developing countries is something that I think needs to improve, and there's much more work to be done in order to make sure that they're brought along in this. And there are different initiatives that I think are working on this, but I think there's a great level of support that can be done specifically in this. That's one example on this, and I'm sure there are many other examples that are more city specific in terms of individual, even more local municipal efforts that can be done in addition to just the broad DFIs.
Okay, thank you very much, Divyata. I'd like to talk a bit about the collaborations. It's key that everyone's mentioned the importance of collaboration between global asset owners, so big like pension funds looking for large-scale investment opportunities. So them, industry leaders from different sectors, the private money looking for innovative strategies and fast scaling, and government and regulators. So those three groups, if you like, are going to have to collaborate a lot. I'd love to get a sense from you, Thomas, from Climate Kick. Is this always going to be a win-win, a kind of no-brainer collaboration, or will there have to be trade-offs and compromises along the line?
Yeah, thanks, Ikenna. I think that the key to this is that it is not going to be simple if we want to get to the impact and scale that we're talking about. A lot of activities happening now in the market that's quite simple, and people are quite good at it. But the collaboration to get to net zero, to get to climate neutrality at a city level or a regional level, is going to take a different kind of approach. And in my view, it'll take a combination of, I think, to Divyata's comment, we need to keep emphasizing the importance of local capital, not because it's going to be the biggest share, but without that share of capital, it's extremely difficult to have the conversations with a bigger capital ecosystem of private investors, senior government, institutional investors, and funders if you're not also well organized and have some capital at the local level. Related to that in the collaborative conversation is we actually, to get to climate neutrality type of outcomes and scale, we need to change policies that shift markets, that change the conditions in the market. So building energy performance isn't going to happen just because we want it to happen. We need to change the market so that the signals are aligned with the right outcomes that we're seeking to drive towards. And cities do that a lot in other domains. They do it with water systems, they do it with other utility systems. And so we need to work with utilities, local government, and senior government to shape the market to suit what it is we're trying to get as an outcome. And if climate neutrality and resilience is the outcome we want, then we're going to have to do that and use private capital to match with the local and public capital, regional capital, potentially national government resources, because that's important to cities, to blend that all together. Now, that's completely doable, but it's not simple because there's a lot of process and there are many decision points along the way that need to be worked through.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Everyone nods, in on the panel when you say it's not going to be simple. And you kicked us off, Jonas, highlighting the complexity of the success scenarios that you've had. But let's talk about then what makes it so difficult. What are the obstacles when we want to work in this way? Jonas, sorry, yeah.
Sure. So I think, there's so many things. So let me just start by thinking that, so in one way, cities, hopefully we understand our own cities pretty good. So we know how the systems operate, we know where the emissions are, we understand the businesses that are involved and so forth. So we kind of have a pretty good idea of that space. I would say that we do not have an understanding of the financial space whatsoever. So we don't know what kind of opportunities are available. We don't know what someone would consider a bankable investment or not. And there's also, so I think there's a lot of cross-learning that needs to happen. So I need to sit down with people like Divyata and understand, right, so what would she think would be something that would be interesting to invest into, and to understand that whole space that we have very little competence or understanding of. And I think the same is for the other way around. We also need to have that conversation the other way. And so the people that are going to fund this transition also needs to understand what is it that needs to be funded, who is actually responsible for making that investment that we're talking about, and what opportunities does that individual or that organization have to make that happen. So if I talk about Malmö, for example, we're AAA rated. We have no problem raising money. We could borrow as much as we wanted to make any kind of investment that we would be interested in, but we are not the ones who are going to be investing into to solve the climate neutrality by 2030. I would say that roughly maybe we will be investing worth maybe 15% of the emissions in Malmö. So that means that 85 or 80% roughly of the emissions are other parties that are responsible for. Some of those we can collaborate with. They will be large infrastructure owners or utilities. They will have their own way of raising funds. And so then you need to start to understand, all right, so what does that mean? Do they need to find new ways of funding or financing their investments, and what would that look like? And then you would have all your citizens. They will need to have a way to finance their transition. And this is where it gets really tricky, because I hear a lot of conversation about bankable investments, and maybe the city could go in as a guarantee, but that's never going to happen in the real world, because the local politicians can never become the guarantee for investments that simply bear too high of a risk. If it doesn't stand on its own two legs, the investment, we will never be able to be that guarantee. So we always have to talk about what is it that needs to change, who is actually responsible for that change, and then what options do we have. The city can support, but we can never be that guarantor for that kind of an investment flow that people are talking about. And I think these are kind of some of the key questions that you need to start to think about. But I also think, tying into Divyata's conversation, I think it's also about realigning already existing investment flows to make sure that they also, so say that you're investing in infrastructure as a city, for example, then you need to start to think about, all right, if I change this investment or tweak it in some way, maybe it can give a climate positive benefit, maybe a health positive benefit, maybe it can help my citizens to make their choices easier and get that transformation space happening. But I think it's also about
Jonas,
understanding your own investments.
Jonas, when I think of systems innovation, especially in the finance and capital space, I wonder if tweaking is enough, because we've talked about how complex these things are. Thomas, is tweaking enough? Like, are we thinking radically enough about this stuff?
Well, I'll give you a very specific example. When I was working on a program in Portland, Oregon, so that's in the U.S., but to try to scale up building retrofit programs. The market was providing homeowners and building owners with loans that were, 5-year loans at 7%. And those were fairly straightforward, easy. That was an easy transaction. But if you actually looked at what the buildings required to reduce energy use and convert to clean sources together, you actually needed 4% 12-year money. So one of the challenges is looking at the divide there and saying, okay, what needs to happen to align that level of activity with that kind of capital? And you have to work on both sides of that. First, you have to get a credible strategy to scale the level of building retrofit activity, because that capital isn't going to likely come for one building at a time kind of financing. So it needs to be more structured. So you need a policy driver to drive aggregation of buildings to go through a retrofitting exercise. The other is nobody who's in the market offering that money without doing the work of soliciting them, talking about what is it going to take. Do you need credit enhancement? What kind of standardization is required so that underwriting and finance can work quickly and efficiently? And you have to socialize that. It takes time. You have to build relationships. I think trust was brought up. And you do need to create this sort of risk management toolkit that will allow for effective problem solving. But I think the key to that is there is plenty of 12-year 4% capital out in the world. It's just not looking for that activity yet. And that activity isn't quite teed up at the scope and scale that allows you to then matchmake. And it sounds a little bit like you need superpowers to put that all together, but you really just need time, effort, persistence, and the ability to build those relationships and push through those problems. I remember working on it, and we'd literally go to lenders and say, will you sign this? And they're like, no. Okay, what needs to change? Will you sign this? You have to be willing to be that persistent to get to the place you need to be.
Clear. Thank you very much. Thomas and Jonas have touched on many of the obstacles. So insufficient credit profile of local actors when Jonas was talking about at a citizen level. Thomas has mentioned the non-standardization of contracts. That makes this stuff very, very difficult to do. You need credible strategies. Is that fundable? Is exploring what sort of strategies and business cases are needed fundable? And policy change. Maybe should cities have more influence when it comes to national policy? Let's explore a little bit more the credible strategy and how we bridge the gap between knowing what you want to finance and actually being able to finance it. Let me ask Divyata and Julio. Divyata first. Is that fundable? Oh, sorry. Well, let's go to Divyata.
No, sorry.
Oh no, Julio's got his hand up. He's desperate.
No,
okay,
yes,
go on, Julio.
I'm so sorry, but I have to leave. So just 1 minute, and I have to go because I have a meeting here. So and apologies about that. So sorry, it's only two comments or two ideas. I would want to talk about collective leadership and collective intelligence. So I think it's what we need to overcome these barriers. So collective leadership is touching upon the Jonas thing about bringing all the parties or all the stakeholders together. It's about bringing, for example, in Valencia, they have the mission ambassadors. They have more than 150 organizations that are committed to become climate neutral by 2030 in their core business. So, for example, a supermarket, the university, for example, a large university of 20,000 students will become climate neutral, the campus, in 2030. So we need this collective leadership. Everybody assuming responsibility, getting commitments, and finding ways to finance this. And that's when we need different instruments. And in terms of collective intelligence, as we won't solve this problem at the pace and scale we need, because that's systemic and it's massive, we need to do things in a different way. And I think the only way to do things in a different way is bringing different intelligences to the table. And we need to create spaces where we can safely think together, the government, local, regional, national, the academia, the civil society and private sector. And it's extremely easy to say and extremely hard to implement, because we need to fund these spaces and we need to create trust and we need to work on the terms of reference for that and give incentives to everybody to participate in these kind of spaces.
Thank you very much, Julio. Divyata, following up on Julio's point about collective leadership, I mean, that's you're part of that. You're plugged into a network like that from a private finance perspective, aren't you? Is it working?
I'd say that we're definitely moving in the right direction. It's a big lift, and for all of the reasons that we're discussing here. But I think that there is a collective responsibility and a recognition that by putting all of our all of the different interests on the table, I think there's a way to actually move in the right direction and in the same direction. So the example that you mentioned earlier, and I think as part of some of the broader initiatives, this isn't just a question of public capital. This isn't just a question of a private capital, nor is it just of the cities, nor is it specifically just of the operators. I think that once everyone has a real sense as to what the different combined interests, but also aligned interests are, then I think we can move in the right direction. So as an example, putting together and mobilizing large-scale capital, which is effectively what is necessary to address some of these issues, and specifically the large-scale problems that we have and that we need to address with regard to the ambitious goals in cities programs as well as others. It's large-scale financing that is needed. Governments themselves are not going to be able to do this. You'd mentioned earlier, and this is a part of the initiatives that I'm very involved with, is working with private capital along the lines of the large-scale pension funds, the large sovereign wealth funds, and others who are very interested and able to provide some of this capital. But how do you do that in a de-risked fashion? How do you do this in a fashion such that their objectives as well are going to be able to be met, whilst at the same time the operators and the cities and the countries themselves are also going to be able to deliver.
Sorry, Divyata, can you perhaps speak up a little bit? I don't know if it's we're struggling to hear the last few sentences.
I apologize. Is that better?
Perfect.
Perhaps I'll turn up the volume at my end. Is that better? I hope. So I think what I was just saying is that, I think that being able to de-risk that in the appropriate fashion makes a big difference. And that's part of the devil being in the details themselves, that I think that everyone is now working in a more concerted fashion around. Blended finance, and we've heard a couple of things that Thomas, for example, has mentioned here, specifically as it relates to blended finance. How do you think more carefully and thoughtfully around some of the domestic financial institutions? How do you think about first loss? When it comes to the types of investment vehicles and the financial instruments that you want to put here? Is it going to be the cities who take the first loss? Is it going to be a national government? So at some level, you do have a different level of a coming together within the cities, the domestic industry, as well as at a sovereign level as well.
Divyata, bankers thinking thoughtfully, I can imagine. When it comes to generating profit, but when we're talking about having to think thoughtfully about funding projects in cities, for instance, that aren't AAA rated, or thinking thoughtfully about a mindset shift when it comes to risk, are they genuinely? Is there genuine appetite amongst bankers at your sector level for this kind of stuff?
I think there is a greater level of an interest in having the conversation, which I think everyone realizes is important, because I think everyone recognizes that this is a global issue. Around what happens in a large city on the other side of the world is something that we will see the outcome of in terms of weather patterns at this side of the world. So I think everyone recognizes that this isn't simply a question of just financial returns. I think where everyone recognizes this is a collective responsibility in order to how do we make this work. I don't think necessarily that there is a plug-and-play solution that one can take from one city and put it exactly to work in the other. I think that's part of what I think is going on, is that to be able to build the right type of model such that they can start to be an additional level of a track record, such that each of these investors then get increasing levels of comfort. But within that, I think we have come a long way. And I think there's several conversations as it relates to specific projects, as it relates to specific investors, all of whom are very engaged in progressing that and making this something that is a really investable asset class.
Okay, thank you, Divyata. Rodrigo, I'll come to you in just a second, Jonas, okay? Rodrigo, I don't know if is Sao Paulo AAA rated or not, but do you, in your experience, when you're going out and looking for money, are people open to, what sorts of reception do you get when you say, for instance, we want to explore a new strategy or business case with respect to a particular project?
Yes, it's going well, and but I think one of the challenges that we still face in São Paulo is regulating. And now there is a new agency called SP Regula, that is in charge with all the regulations in the structure of the city hall. In São Paulo, we have a very giant structure, and one of the most challenges I think that we face is to coordinate all the bodies and the departments involved, for example, in the climate change action plan and sorry. Yes, and
oh, have we? Yeah, okay, use my mic.
So, very kind. Yeah, okay. And this is takes political leadership and the importance not only to get the coordination inside the city hall, but all the players involved and the society.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonas, you had your hand up.
So I just wanted to, I think, two reflections on my side. One was actually that I don't think that it necessarily needs to be super complex, even though I work in city spaces and that's super complex to deal with this transition. But I think there's also, I wanted to just raise an example like IKEA, for example, have partnered up with with two local Swedish companies, one to sell heat pumps and the other one to sell solar cells, solar installations. And so all of a sudden, you as a customer, you can go to IKEA and buy your heat and energy production solution, and they deal with the financing of it, they deal with the installation of it and the supply of it. And I think that's also a mechanism that I think is we're gonna see more of those kind of partnerships where funding streams can go to a retailer who will then set up a whole solution package basically in play. And I think we'll see more of, which I think is very interesting, at least when you start to talk about the change at an individual or family level to solve some of the solutions that we're looking for. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about, at least raise the aspect of stranded assets, which at least in the European context, stranded assets are becoming a major player right now, I would say, especially when it comes to the energy sector. And for example, in the current energy crisis that we have in Europe, a fairly large energy provider or utility was bought up by the German government for a very large sum of money. And now that utility is going to have a loss of 40 billion euros this year. And I think that is also something that that I think funders or investors are also considering, is that there's already a risk being taken by investors in many different options. And so I think that that's also something that needs to be balanced, the risk of investing into the future and the risk of holding current investments, and what would that mean? And I think that's just a reflection that it's easy to talk about risks in city space as it's something new, but risks are already being taken. And I'm not a risk expert, but I think the risk is something we need to have a conversation about. What's a reasonable risk and what does that look like, and compare that with other risks that we're already accepting. So that was just a reflection on my side.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. There appears to be a rock band in the pavilion somewhere, so it's getting a little bit louder. But we're moving towards the close, and you mentioned the future there, Jonas. I'd like us to consider what that might look like, and perhaps starting off thinking about something Julio said about the need to create safe spaces where we can experiment. Thomas, is that a likely part of the future?
It's a great question. Not only is it part of the future, it's part of the present now in Europe as we pursue this European mission of climate neutral cities by 2030. I'd lose my job if I didn't make a plug for that. But the idea behind the mission of 100 cities climate neutral by 2030 is really to create this innovation space for cities and experts and sources of capital, et cetera, to all come together with a big sandbox of cities who are willing to try new policies, work on new structures, new ways of delivering on decarbonization, whether it's in buildings or in the transportation sector, et cetera. And so really creating this sort of innovation lab at a European scale, right? Because getting 100 cities to climate neutral or 112 doesn't really address the climate problem if we're not figuring out how to help all the other cities around the globe follow in that pathway. And so it really needs to be focused on learning and developing new models, new policies, new structures for how capital can be deployed faster and more effectively for the impacts that we have. So we're starting down that path now.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very briefly, are there any questions in the audience? Yes, a hand shot up at the back. Okay, I'm going to come and find you. Sorry. What's your name? What's your question?
Hi, I came in half an hour late, but Brendan Kern, I work at the London School of Economics, Grantham Research Institute. I know Thomas's work and we know each other for a few years. Apologies if this has already been covered, but I think the real challenge in terms of bringing together a portfolio of assets in a city. Hello? Oh, God, I can hear myself. That's terrifying. What I was saying is the main challenge is mixing together different assets that have different return profiles and risk profiles into a single portfolio. And Thomas, I know you're working on this, but I'd be interested to hear from others. How do we overcome that? Is it with a single new asset type, like based around a city, place-based asset type? Otherwise, there's the risk that investors will just cherry pick those with the greatest returns and we end up with exacerbating problems, really.
Let's ask this one to Divyata, please. Great question.
Yeah, I think that thank you for the question. I think there are different examples of this that I think are increasingly being explored. So the idea of cherry picking, I think, is defeatist in every single way, in large part because that's exactly how one is not going to be able to get that large scale capital and how one is not going to be able to achieve the type of joint initiative that we're aiming for across the both domestic as well as some of the international market participants. So a way such that there can be, and broadly this is a question of a risk, so how does one share the risk? There can be questions and elements of how one can think about a first loss, for example, which can help alleviate in the early days to bring a project to a fruition. But beyond that, the idea of returns being imbalanced around outside investors versus others is, I think, somewhat defeatist. I believe that there will likely be more of a progression of the type of way one is going to be thinking about the different returns across different aspects of the cap structure, if one wants to think about it that way. In terms of the domestic, in terms of the city, in terms of the international investors. But increasingly what one wants to work toward is that this is going to be very much of a win-win after all, and we talked about this at the early part of the conversation, how does one over time start to also invest in and develop a really strong ecosystem of domestic financial institutions. If one was to double, and I think it's a very, very meaningful number, but if one was to only just double the capacity that they currently have, we are very well on the way to achieving the net zero targets that most cities would be able to get to.
Okay, thank you, Divyata. Is there time for one more? There's time for one more question from the audience? No. Then I think we're going to leave it there, everyone. Thank you very much. It's clear that systems innovation is kind of key to unlocking the potential finance has to help us achieve our climate ambitions. I love the idea of what Thomas was saying at European level, really creating systems innovation labs where we can experiment with all of the ideas that we've heard here today. We need to embrace the complexity. It's not simple, but it's fun problem solving, isn't it? It's fun. Thank you very much to all of our guests. Thank you, Divyata, Jonas, and Thomas, and Julio, who had to leave us earlier. And with me in the room, the two lonesome panelists. Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and myself, Ikenna Azuike. Take care.
Thank you.
It was challenging.